So thus far we have been learning how to talk about the past using the preterite. Now you may recall that when I mentioned at the beginning of the preterite that we were going to learn how to talk about the past, that I mentioned that there are actually two ways to talk about the past. This is one of many examples in Spanish where we have two things to discuss one thing that we would use in English. So in Spanish, we can talk about the past using either the preterite or we can use the imperfect. Now, the reasons for using either of these tenses we will look at a later video, but for the moment, it's important to realize that the endings for the imperfect are going to be different, right? Because remember, our endings tell us who is speaking and where we are in time. So even though we're still in the past, the ending has to tell us that we are not in the preterite anymore, or that we are not in a past that involves the preterite, but we are now in a past that involves the imperfect. So it is important first, before we think about knowing how to choose between these two different types of conjugation, to learn what is the endings for the imperfect and how do they work. Well, similar to how we used our other endings in the present and then also with the preterite, mainly what we will do with the imperfect is we will learn simply how to put on the correct ending onto a regular stem. Now, one of the neat things about the imperfect is that unlike the preterite where we have 4 different types of verbs, the imperfect actually only has 2 verb categories, and those are regular and irregular. There are actually only 2 forms of the irregular that we will learn in the process of this course. So you actually only have to memorize 2 irregular imperfect verbs, and then you can just assume that all the other ones are regular. So what are the endings for the imperfect then? I have them written down here for us to take a quick glance at them. The endings for AR, imperfect regular verbs, are going to be like this. Aba, abas, aba, abamos, abais, aban. And for ER and IR, we're also going to use the same ending. So it will be ia, ias, ia, iamos, iais, ian. You may notice the difference in the accents between the AR and the ER and the IR. So notice that there's only an accent mark on the nosotros in the AR form, but there are accent marks for all of the ER and IR endings. So what would this look like if we actually conjugated a verb using the imperfect? Well, I've created 2 examples for us to look at them kind of together, okay? So if we had hablar, for example, this is how we might conjugate it in the imperfect to talk about a past event. So here we go. We have yo hablaba, tú hablabas, él, ella, usted hablaba, nosotros hablábamos, vosotros hablabais, ellos, ellas, ustedes hablaban. Now it kind of can sound a little bit silly, especially with all the B's, right? And if you think about verbs that are even a little bit more complex, right? Yo desayunaba, or yo almorzaba, or yo trabajaba. It can sound a little bit like a lot of syllables in there, but that's really how you would say it. You would also, so let's look at a different one, right? I have 2 examples. I have vivir and comer. So we have an ER and then I also have an example of an IR verb. So it would be yo comía or yo vivía, right? Tú comías, tú vivías, él, ella, usted comía, vivía. Here we have nosotros comíamos, nosotros vivíamos, vosotros comíais, vosotros vivíais, ellos, ellas, ustedes comían, vivían. Right? So those would be some examples of how to conjugate ER and IR as opposed to conjugating an AR verb. So what are our 2 examples of irregulars? Now that we've kind of figured this out, because this is actually very simple, right? This is exactly what we do with the preterite. Now we're just learning different endings. So it's basically what we've been doing so far. It's exactly the same. The only difference is we're just learning some new endings. So what would be the endings then, or what would be the differences for the irregulars? Particularly, right, we're going to look at ir and ser, okay? Ir meaning to go and ser meaning to be, right? So here we would see that ir would become iba, ibas, iba, íbamos, ibais, iban. Why would that be irregular? It would be irregular because this is an AR conjugation, but id is an IR type of verb. So it is an irregular conjugation of id, but id is always irregular, if you'll remember. Now here we have ser, and ser is also always irregular. And here we have another example, right? Yo era, tú eras, él era, nosotros éramos, vosotros erais, ellos eran. Okay, so this would be also the irregular conjugation of ser in the imperfect. So let's take some examples and actually conjugate two of them and kind of see how they would work, right? Because they're actually exactly what we've been doing before. Now we're just popping on a different tense. But let's look at it. So if we wanted to talk about something that we would do every year at Christmas in a past situation, we would use the imperfect. So here we have, right, todos los años, meaning every year. So I'm talking about things that I and other people did every year at Christmas. The first example says, yo comprar muchos regalos en Navidad. So every year at Christmas, I would buy a lot of presents. So I want to tell my friends that every year I would go through this process of buying presents. So here we go. So I want to say yo, and I want to use an imperfect. So I would do it exactly like I would do the regular. I would take off my AR, and then I can write my root right in the blank there. Then, using the fact that I have a yo here, I would find the correct ending based on the person, and then also based on the singular or the plural. So I know that yo is going to be a first person singular, so I know that my correct ending is going to be aber. So the way that I would say I used to buy a lot of presents in the imperfect, I would say it like this. Yo compraba muchos regalos en Navidad. If I had ellos, right, or if I have this other example where I want to use an IR or an ER, I would do pretty much exactly the same thing, right? So I'm going to take off my AR. Well, this one is actually another AR. So I would take off the AR, and then I'm also going to find, right, where the person is. So that's going to be third person plural, right? So I would do it again, right? Ellos enviaban. They sent a lot of presents at Christmas also, right? Or they sent a lot of cards at Christmas also. There are two things that we can notice, right, about the imperfect that are a little unusual. The first is, of course, the accent marks. These are actually very important as they tell us where to put the stress. The other that's unusual about the imperfect is that you may have noticed that the first person and the third person, singular, are the same. How would you know which is which? Well, certainly you would know because it's going to include a personal pronoun, right? So you're going to have either the yo or the ella or the él or the usted. So you're going to know which one you're talking about. But the other way would just be simply by context, right? When you were speaking with someone, you probably wouldn't confuse a time when you were talking about yourself as opposed to a time when you were talking about somebody else. So you would just kind of know that based on context. All right, now that we have learned how to conjugate the imperfect as opposed to the preterite, I would like you to practice conjugating the imperfect. So what I would like for you to do is on a 3x5 note card, just conjugate one form of the imperfect from each one, right? So one from the AR on the front, and then one from either the ER or the IR on the back. Remember that ER and IR in the imperfect conjugate exactly the same way. So you can choose either an ER verb or an IR verb and conjugate it in the imperfect. Remember, of course, to use the personal pronouns, right, as in the yo, tú, nosotros, vosotros, and pop it on the corkboard, and whenever I get into class, I'll check it. And as always, be prepared to share just in case I decide to call on you. Thanks, and I will see you in class.